The next morning along the Nile isn't exactly quiet. There's a soft hum of life all around you. Women are hauling baskets of barley from low, mud-brick storehouses. Men in simple linen kilts are turning grinding stones in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. The air full of the sound of grain being crushed into meal. And somewhere, out of sight, you hear a faint bubbling, like a contented stew. You follow it to a shady courtyard, and there it is. A huge ceramic vat, its surface foaming gently. Egyptian beer. And before you wrinkle your nose, this isn't your craft IPA with a pretentious label. It's cloudy, thick, and more of a porridge you can drink. The kind you could scoop up with a wooden ladle and chew a little. The smell? Sweet, yeasty, and just a hint sour, with a faint spice that tickles your nose. Beer wasn't just a weekend treat here. It was the drink of daily life. Safer than Nile water, easier to make than wine, and packed with calories for farmers, builders, and even kids. The mainstream fact: the Egyptians brewed beer from emmer wheat or barley, baking the grain into partially cooked loaves, crumbling them into vats of water, and letting natural fermentation do its thing. What you end up with is low in alcohol by modern standards, most of the time. And here's where the story gets interesting. There's evidence from residue analysis on jars that some batches weren't just barley and water. Herbs, dates, mandrake, even possibly fermented figs found their way into the brew. Each addition had its own flavor, and in some cases, its own little chemical kick. Mandrake root, for example, contains compounds with mild hallucinogenic properties, and it shows up in Egyptian medical texts and art, often linked to love charms. Whether it was intentional party fuel or just someone had extra roots lying around is something historians still argue about. Picture the workman's village at Deir el Medina. It's late afternoon, the air is cooling just a little, and you're sitting in a courtyard surrounded by mud brick walls painted with quick, chalky designs. Someone passes you a cup, unglazed, rough at the lip. You take a swallow. It's warm, earthy, almost bready. Then you notice your limbs relax. Your head feels just a little lighter. You're not exactly tipsy, but you could be if you had a few more. And some batches. They could have been stronger, far stronger, especially if the brewer was generous with honey or dates to feed the yeast. There's a quirky little scene in one tomb painting showing beer drinkers at a banquet, one leaning a little too far back, another looking like he's about to nap in his soup. Whether it's just artistic humor or a subtle hint that these beers were more than harmless thirst quenchers, well, let's just say ancient artists had a way of slipping in the truth. And here's your reality check. Those building the pyramids weren't fueled by mystical energy or alien tech. They were fueled by beer rations, thousands of liters a day, distributed as part of wages. Imagine working under the desert sun with a steady buzz. Maybe that's why some blocks got placed a little crooked. By the time you leave the courtyard, the brewer is ladling fresh beer into jars sealed with reeds. You can almost hear tomorrow's laughter in the foam. The sun is dipping low over the Nile now, turning the water the color of old copper. You're not heading back to the beer courtyard this time. Instead, you're following the winding lanes that lead toward the mansion of someone who's clearly important. Whitewashed walls, a tall wooden door with copper fittings, and the faint sound of stringed instruments drifting out from somewhere inside. Inside the courtyard, servants are carrying trays of something darker, richer, and far more expensive than beer. Wine. Unlike the beer that every farmer, mason, and fisherman drank daily, wine in ancient Egypt was mostly for the elite, nobles, priests, and royalty. Mainstream history tells us that wine was usually imported from the Levant in Egypt's early days, But by the New Kingdom, they were growing their own vineyards in the fertile delta. And they weren't just bottling the grape juice and calling it a day. You glance at the jars lined along the wall, each painted with symbols that tell you where it came from, when it was made, and sometimes, intriguingly, what was in it. Archaeologists have found traces of herbs, tree resins, and even possibly psychoactive additives in ancient wine jars. Imagine sipping a deep red vintage laced with myrrh, bitter, fragrant, and maybe a little more than just aromatic. Myrrh contains terpenes that, in large enough amounts, can create mild sedative effects. Add that to the alcohol, and you've got yourself a recipe for a softer, dreamier evening. Historians still argue whether some of these additives were purely medicinal, entirely ceremonial, or just for flavor. But the banquets tell their own story. You're sitting on a low cushion now, watching dancers sway to the music. The air smells of grilled duck, baked bread, and the sharp tang of resinous incense. A servant refills your cup with a deep garnet-colored wine. You sip, and it coats your tongue with warmth, followed by a strange, almost cooling aftertaste from whatever herbs they've steeped into it. A quirky tidbit? Some wines were thickened with honey to make them sweeter and stronger. The sugars gave the yeast more to work with, sometimes pushing the alcohol content higher than what you'd expect. Others might be flavored with wild herbs gathered along the Nile, some of which modern botanists say had mild psychoactive qualities. There's a wall painting from a Theban tomb that shows guests at a wine banquet, two of them leaning on each other, eyes half shut in bliss. Above them, the hieroglyphs for "make merry." Whether that meant drunkenness, herbal euphoria, or both, you'll never know. But it's a reminder that people, no matter the century, have always enjoyed tweaking the brain's chemistry. By the time you leave the banquet, the courtyard is lit with oil lamps, the air thick with the perfume of wine and resin. Somewhere behind you, someone laughs too loud, and you're pretty sure they've had more than one kind of drink tonight. The next day begins not in the bustling streets, but in the shadowy coolness of a temple. You step through a towering pylon gate, its walls carved with gods striding across the stone, the air heavy with a resinous haze. The deeper you walk, the more the sunlight fades, replaced by a flickering gold from oil lamps. And there it is, the scent that's been clinging to your skin since you entered. Frankincense, myrrh, and kaifi smoke swirling through the chamber. Kaifi is the temple's signature incense, a blend of herbs, resins, wine, honey, and possibly ingredients no one wrote down for outsiders to know. Mainstream fact: kaifi is documented in Egyptian medical and ritual texts as both a perfume and a remedy. It was burned in honor of the gods, used to freshen homes, and even prescribed as a cure for bad breath. But chemical analysis of preserved chunks suggests it may also have contained ingredients with mild psychoactive effects, like juniper berries and possibly blue lotus. You stand before a massive altar, the priest slowly fanning the smoke toward a carved statue of the god. The air is so thick you can taste it. Your eyes feel a little heavier, your shoulders loosen. Is it the lack of fresh air in here, or something else? Historians still argue whether temple incense was intended to induce a trance-like state in priests, helping them feel closer to the gods, or whether it was simply symbolic and sensory. But when you consider the concentration of the smoke in these enclosed chambers, it's not hard to imagine a few lightheaded moments. A quirky little detail? Some temple inscriptions claim that kaifi, when burned at night, causes one to see good dreams. That sounds poetic, until you realize that certain plant oils in the recipe are known in modern herbalism to influence REM sleep. Whether this was divine magic or just ancient aromatherapy, the effect was real enough for them to write it down. The ritual continues. The priest chants in a low, rhythmic voice, each phrase drifting upward into the smoke. The walls around you are alive with flickering light and shadow, as if the gods themselves are stepping closer. You feel warm, slow, and strangely serene, as though you've had one glass of wine too many, but without the fogginess. And here's your reality check. Unlike a modern religious service, these ceremonies could last for hours, sometimes deep into the night. You'd be breathing this dense, fragrant haze the entire time. If you walked in sober, you might not walk out quite the same. When you finally step back into the open air, the Nile breeze feels sharper, cooler, and almost startlingly real, like waking up from a vivid dream. Somewhere behind you, the priest is still chanting, the smoke still curling into the ancient dark. By now, you've seen the Egyptians drink their flowers, sip their resins, and breathe their smoke. But there's another, far stranger place where mood-altering substances turn up: the embalming workshop. You're standing in a dim, reed-roofed building near the edge of a necropolis. Outside, the desert stretches flat and pale. Inside, it smells of pine, spice, and something sharp enough to sting your nose. On a wooden table, a body lies wrapped in rough linen, attendants moving around it with practiced calm. They're not rushing. Mummification was a 70-day process, and every stage had its rituals. Mainstream history tells us the embalmers used imported cedar oil, frankincense, myrrh, juniper, cinnamon, and other resins to preserve the body and mask decay. But here's where it gets interesting. Many of these substances contain compounds that can affect the human nervous system when inhaled in concentrated amounts. You lean closer to the vat of warm resin and feel a faint, almost dizzying rush from the fumes. Historians still argue whether embalmers experienced these effects as a side consequence of their work, or whether they leaned into it, seeing the altered state as part of their sacred duty. Imagine spending hours surrounded by intense aromatic clouds, frankincense's boswellic acids, myrrh's sesquiterpenes, cedarwood's calming cedrol, all saturating the air in a closed space. A quirky detail? Some ancient recipes for embalming pastes include henbane seeds, a plant that in large doses can cause hallucinations, dizziness, and, in less fortunate cases, unconsciousness. Whether the henbane was there for preservation or for symbolic opening of the senses to the afterlife is anyone's guess. You watch as one worker sprinkles powdered cinnamon into the resin before applying it to the linen wrappings. The scent blooms into the air, sweet, woody, almost mouth-watering, but mixed with something heavier, bitter underneath. Your eyes water slightly, your breathing slows. You realize that standing here for hours would leave you in a strange, almost trance-like calm. It's worth remembering that mummification wasn't just a technical process. It was a religious act. In their worldview, the embalmers weren't simply preserving a corpse. They were helping a soul transition into eternity. If drifting into a mild altered state helped them feel in touch with the divine realm, it might have been welcomed. By the time you step out of the workshop, the desert air feels startlingly clean, and you can't tell if the tightness in your head is from the heat or the spices. The next stretch of your journey begins in a marketplace, and not the polite, quiet kind. This one is alive with shouting vendors, clucking geese, and the steady clank of bronze weights hitting stone counters. You weave past stalls piled high with onions, baskets of dried fish, and jars of golden honey until you find something that doesn't quite fit. A tightly sealed clay vessel. small enough to hold in one hand but guarded like it's worth its weight in gold. The seller, a man with sunburnt cheeks and a linen head wrap, cracks the lid just enough for you to catch a whiff. It's faint, earthy, and almost sweet. He calls it sleep powder, though you notice he avoids saying what it's made from. This is where we step into one of the more controversial corners of Egyptology, the idea that opium made its way to the Nile long before the Romans ever touched it. Mainstream history is cautious here. Opium poppies were cultivated in the eastern Mediterranean by at least the late Bronze Age, but whether Egyptians used the sap themselves is still debated. Some argue that the famous poppy-shaped vessels found in burial sites are just symbolic containers for scented oil. Others point to residue analysis on a few rare artifacts that suggests the presence of morphine alkaloids. You lift the little jar and imagine, if the theory is right, how it might have been used. A pinch dissolved in wine for pain relief, a dab for calming the nerves, maybe even a ritual dose to slip into a half-waking dream state. In an age before morphine, syringes, and painkillers, something like this would have felt like a gift from the gods. A quirky tidbit? There's a carving in Thebes showing a nurse giving something to a fussy child from a small rounded vessel. Some scholars say it's just a depiction of a honey sweet. Others wonder if it was an early version of a sleep draft, not exactly the kind of bedtime story you'd read today. You follow the merchant to the back of his stall, where bundles of dried herbs hang from the ceiling. He tells you about traders from Cyprus and Crete who bring strange seeds and powders. The poppy, he says, blooms red in the spring, then fades, leaving behind pods that hold the milk. He mimics scoring the pods with a knife, letting the sap bead up. You can almost see it in your mind. The slow, careful work. The sticky resin scraped into a jar. Historians still argue whether ancient Egyptians used opium for pleasure, for medicine, or at all. But if they did, it's easy to see how a culture already skilled in mixing resins, herbs, and perfumes might have recognized its power. One sip, one inhale, and the sharp edges of the world would soften. By the time you step back into the noisy market, the jar is gone, sold to someone whose walk is just a little slower now, a little looser, as they disappear into the crowd. The Nile is still, its surface catching the pink glow of dawn, when you find yourself walking past a cluster of reed huts on the riverbank. A fisherman waves from his small papyrus skiff, but it's not fish he's pulling in. It's bundles of tall, serrated leaves and seed-laden flowers. He stacks them neatly on the shore, their scent faint but distinctive, especially if you've walked through certain parts of modern cities. This, some say, could be cannabis, though the truth is tangled in debate. Mainstream historians agree that hemp was known in the ancient world for rope-making and textiles. Fibers found in Egyptian tombs suggest they worked with the plant. But what about the psychoactive side? That's where things get hazy, in more ways than one. Residue analyses of a few ancient Egyptian smoking devices, rare and fragile, have hinted at traces of cannabinoids, though critics say contamination can't be ruled out. Some medical papyri mention remedies that sound suspiciously like cannabis preparations, crushed leaves and seeds mixed with honey to cool the womb or quiet the spirit. Whether these were strictly medicinal or occasionally recreational is a question historians still argue about. You sit on a flat rock by the water as one of the fishermen kneels to sort his harvest. He crushes a leaf between his fingers and rubs it into his palm, releasing an earthy, spicy aroma. Then he pulls a little clay brazier closer, drops in a pinch of the dried flowering tops, and fans the coals until a thin ribbon of smoke curls upward. He leans over it, eyes half closed, then gestures for you to try. A quirky detail? There's a faint depiction in the tomb of Ramses II that shows musicians and dancers gathered in a smoky room. One of them holding a small handled bowl that some researchers think could be a censer for burning herbs. The figure's eyes are painted slightly heavier, as if hinting at a dazed or dreamy expression. Whether that's just artistic flourish or a subtle nod to altered states, no one can say for sure. You lean toward the brazier. The smoke is warm, dry, and carries that same earthy note you smelled earlier. It fills your lungs, and though the effect isn't immediate, there's a definite shift. A loosening in your shoulders, a slower pace in your thoughts. Is it suggestion, the soft morning air, or something in the plant itself? Hard to tell. But as the fishermen joke with one another in the background, you realize that whatever this is, it's been part of their rhythm for a long time. As the sun climbs higher, the bundles are loaded into a cart headed toward the village. Rope, medicine, incense, or something more? The truth may be lost to time, but the smell still lingers on your hands. By midday, the Nile's glare is blinding, and the air carries the smells of roasting meat and fresh bread. You follow those smells into the heart of a noble's estate, where a banquet is already in full swing. Linen awnings stretch overhead, muting the sunlight into a golden haze. Musicians strum lyres, their rhythms slow and lazy, while servants glide between low tables with trays piled high. This isn't just dinner. It's a performance of wealth, status, and pleasure. And on those trays, not just the roasted goose and honey cakes you'd expect. There are bowls of figs stuffed with nuts and herbs, platters of fish glazed in something that smells faintly of anise, and, most intriguing, small cups of a dark syrup flecked with crushed petals. Mainstream history confirms that elite Egyptian feasts were legendary for their abundance and variety. But what's less often discussed is the possibility that some of these dishes were laced with mood-altering plants. Dates steeped in fermented wine, pastries dusted with mandrake or poppy seeds, fish marinades with blue lotus infusion. Each bite could carry more than just flavor. Historians still argue whether these banquet enhancements were deliberate indulgences or simply the overlap of culinary and medicinal traditions. Ancient Egyptian recipes often blurred that line. What healed could also intoxicate, and what intoxicated might be framed as good for the heart. You take one of the little cups from a passing tray. The syrup is thick, sweet with honey, but has a sharp, almost peppery bite at the end. Moments later, you feel warmth blooming from your chest outward, your ears catching the music more vividly, the chatter around you turning into a soft, pleasant hum. A quirky detail? In some tomb scenes of banquets, artists painted guests in progressively more relaxed and less dignified poses as you read the image from left to right. The first figures are upright and proper. By the end, they're leaning on each other, hair slightly mussed, garlands slipping down their necks. It's as if the painting itself is a time-lapse of the night's mood. You're halfway through a plate of honeyed bread when the dancers arrive. Women in sheer linen, their skin glistening in the heat, moving in slow, hypnotic steps. The music deepens, drums echoing under the lyres. Someone refills your cup without asking, and you notice the flowers floating on its surface. Blue lotus again, curling slightly at the edges from the heat. As the afternoon stretches toward evening, the air thickens with incense and the smell of wine. Laughter spills from every corner, and you catch glimpses of guests slipping away to shaded alcoves, returning later with flushed cheeks and slower steps. Whatever was in those dishes, it's worked its way into everyone's bloodstream by now, yours included. By the time the last plates are cleared, the banquet has blurred into something dreamlike. The music seems farther away, the light softer, and every movement leaves a faint trail in your vision, like the air itself is swaying with the dancers. The feast lingers in your mind as you walk through a narrow street the next morning, the city waking slowly around you. The air here smells different, not of bread ovens or river reeds, but of something rich, heady, and sweet enough to stop you mid-step. You follow it to a small open shop shaded by woven mats, where rows of tiny alabaster bottles glisten like trapped moonlight. This is the perfumer's domain, and here, fragrance isn't just a luxury, it's a kind of magic. Mainstream history tells us that perfumes in ancient Egypt were made from oils like moringa or sesame, infused with herbs, flowers, and resins. They were worn by the wealthy, offered to the gods, and even buried with the dead. But some recipes hint at more than just scent. Ingredients like blue lotus, myrrh, and spikenard all contain compounds that, in high enough concentrations, can have mild psychoactive or sedative effects. The perfumer, an older woman with deft hands, dips a carved stick into one of the bottles and lets a drop fall onto your wrist. The oil is thick, almost sticky, warming immediately against your skin. You lift your hand to your face and inhale. The sweetness of lotus, the resinous depth of myrrh, and an undertone you can't quite name. Within minutes, you feel a subtle shift, as if your breathing has deepened and your thoughts have slowed just slightly. Historians still argue whether this effect was intentional or simply a pleasant side effect of luxury oils worn in quantity. But given how often perfumes appear in contexts of love poetry, banquets, and temple rites, it's not a stretch to think people noticed more than just the smell. A quirky tidbit? Some partygoers wore perfume cones, little lumps of scented wax placed on top of the head, which would slowly melt in the heat, releasing fragrance down hair and skin. Imagine spending an entire evening breathing in a steady trickle of blue lotus-infused oil. It's hard not to think it might have done more than just mask the smell of a hot crowd. You browse the shelves, noticing that some bottles are sealed with wax and labeled with symbols of the moon, stars, or lotus blossoms. The perfumer explains that certain blends are meant for sleep, others for lifting the heart, and a few for opening the senses. You buy a small vial, tucking it into your belt. As you step back into the sunlit street, the scent follows you. A portable haze, wrapping you in the faint suggestion that the city is just a little softer, a little slower than it was a moment ago. The heat of the day has faded into a warm, amber dusk when you follow the sound of drums toward a gathering outside the city walls. Here, in a wide, sandy clearing surrounded by low stone tombs, families have set out mats, baskets, and jars. The smell of roasting meat drifts through the air, mingled with the sharper tang of wine and incense. This is no ordinary dinner. It's a funerary feast, held in honor of someone who's been gone for years, maybe centuries. Mainstream history records these commemorative banquets as a way to honor ancestors, feed their spirits, and reaffirm ties between the living and the dead. People would bring offerings to the tomb: bread, beer, wine, flowers, and share the meal right there beside it. But some scholars suggest these gatherings may have involved more than just remembrance. The combination of potent wine, blue lotus garlands, and thick clouds of burning kaifi could have created an atmosphere that blurred the edges between mourning, celebration, and altered states. You're sitting cross-legged on a woven mat when a woman presses a cup into your hands. The wine is darker than most, almost black, and carries a smell like spiced honey. You sip. It's sweet at first, then dry, then faintly numbing along the tongue. Around you, voices rise and fall in a kind of chant, the rhythm syncing with the slow pulse of the drums. Historians still argue whether these effects were intended to help participants feel closer to the deceased, or whether they were simply part of the indulgence of a special occasion. But it's worth noting that in some tomb paintings, guests at these feasts are shown reclining or leaning into one another, their garlands drooping, their cups always full. A quirky detail: some offering lists carved into tomb walls include not only food and drink, but incense to please the nose and lotus to gladden the heart. That last phrase might be poetic, but given what we know about lotus infusions, it's possible it was also quite literal. The air grows thicker as night falls. Someone nearby is burning a resinous block in a clay brazier, the smoke curling in lazy ribbons. You inhale without thinking, and suddenly the night seems sharper, the stars brighter, the drums deeper, the scent of the food more vivid. You're not sure if it's the wine, the incense, or both, but you feel suspended between the living voices around you and the silent presence of the tombs behind them. By the time the feast ends, you've almost forgotten where you are. The crowd scatters slowly, leaving offerings behind: bread, flowers, and small jars of perfumed oil, for the spirits to enjoy. You rise, your head pleasantly light, and the darkness feels warmer than it should. Morning finds you drifting down the Nile in a narrow wooden boat, the oars dipping silently into water as smooth as polished glass. The river is wide here, lined with papyrus reeds that sway gently in the breeze. Every so often, you pass clusters of plants with strange blooms, some white, some pale purple, some so small you might miss them unless you lean close. Mainstream history often focuses on the blue lotus when talking about Egypt's river plants, but the Nile was home to a whole pharmacy of aquatic species. Sweet flag, with its sword-like leaves, was known for its pungent rhizome that could be chewed for a warming, stimulating effect. Papyrus itself could be brewed into a mild infusion, though more for refreshment than intoxication. And then there's the lesser-known Nelumbo nucifera, the sacred pink lotus, which carried its own set of chemical compounds that modern researchers think might have worked alongside alcohol to produce a gentle euphoria. You trail your fingers in the water as your guide pulls the boat closer to the reeds. He plucks a few stalks of sweet flag and breaks one open, releasing a peppery, citrus-like scent. He hands you a piece, gesturing to chew. The taste is sharp, almost medicinal, but after a few minutes there's a subtle lift, a slight clarity in your thoughts, a brightness in the morning light. Historians still argue whether these plants were used deliberately for their psychoactive potential or simply as flavoring, medicine, or religious offerings. The boundary in ancient Egypt was thin. The same herb might appear in a healing poultice, a temple ritual, and a cup of wine at a feast. A quirky tidbit? Some New Kingdom love poems describe lovers meeting where the lotus blooms and the sweet reed bends, which sounds romantic enough, but also suspiciously like a coded reference to gathering ingredients for a night's entertainment. Your guide sets the boat adrift in a quiet cove, the reeds forming a green wall around you. The air is warm, humid, and heavy with plant scents. Somewhere close by, a bird calls, its voice slow and musical. You can feel the boat rocking gently, the water slapping against its sides in a rhythm that matches your breathing. Whether it's the sweet flag, the stillness, or the suggestion of the place itself, there's a sensation of being slightly outside yourself, like you could fall into the water and simply keep drifting without a care. As you head back toward the main current, you glance behind at the wall of reeds. It looks unchanged, but you can't shake the feeling that it's holding on to a piece of you. The sun has climbed high now, throwing a molten glare across the Nile's ripples as you step ashore onto a dusty bank. Before you, a cluster of mud brick buildings leans into the wind, their walls streaked with faded paint, scenes of gods with falcon heads, boats sailing toward the horizon, and strangely enough, a few hieroglyphs that your guide insists are actually recipes. You duck inside one of the larger houses, the cool dimness swallowing you up. The air smells of baked bread, and something more pungent, like resin and sun-baked herbs. In the corner, an elderly woman is crouched over a flat stone slab, grinding together a mix of dried leaves, seeds, and a glossy amber substance that catches the light when she turns it. She greets you with a quick glance, then pushes the mix into a small clay pot, topping it with what looks like thick honey. Mainstream fact? Honey was Egypt's miracle binder. They used it for food, medicine, preservation, and in this case, to mellow out certain bitter plant preparations. The sweetness masked harsh flavors, and its antibacterial qualities meant a concoction could be stored for weeks without spoiling. She offers you the pot, along with a flat wooden stick to scoop a taste. The first thing you notice is the resin. Frankincense, unmistakable and sharp, cutting through the sweetness. The second is a low, warming buzz that blooms in your chest. This is no casual snack. Historians still argue whether frankincense's mood-altering effects were known and sought after, or if people were chasing its sacred, purifying scent. The resin contains compounds that, in high enough amounts, can have mild psychoactive properties, something modern researchers only confirmed recently. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some old temple records, there's mention of the Feast of Scents, where participants would eat resin-infused cakes until the room swayed with the god's presence. It's possible that wasn't just poetic metaphor. You settle onto a reed mat as the woman and your guide speak in hushed tones. The clay walls seem to press in slightly, the painted symbols wriggling at the edges of your vision like they're breathing. The hum in your body doesn't fade. It settles, wrapping around you like a warm blanket. Somewhere outside, children are laughing, their voices oddly far away, though you know they're just in the next street. You watch the woman seal another pot with a thick smear of wax, pressing a fingerprint into the surface as if claiming it. She gives you a look that's somewhere between amusement and knowing, as if you've joined a club without realizing it. By the time you step back into the blinding daylight, you feel both heavier and lighter, grounded in your steps, but slightly untethered in thought. The air seems thicker, the sky deeper, and the path ahead almost too vivid to be real.